Good evening. I'm Janet Wright, chair-elect, actually, of the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, who are sponsors for this evening Howard Wooden Lecture Series. It's my pleasure to be here, and I welcome those of you who are here at the museum with us and those of you who are at home wrapped in a blanket staying warm, which most of us here probably wish we had. I am a fairly new member of the Friends, and so I've learned a great deal about that organization over the last couple of years, and I thought I'd share a little bit about that before we go on and introduce Patricia, who will introduce our speaker this evening. The Friends were established in 1960 by a request of the city of Wichita, who wanted an organization that could help raise funds to support this new museum. And at that point, the Friends were born. Well, in 1985, Howard Wooden was then chair of this museum, or I should say executive director of this museum, and they were getting ready to celebrate the 50th anniversary for the founding of the museum. And he came to the Friends, who were a group of Wichita natives, I believe, who really felt strongly about the arts and wanted to support it in any way they could, and asked them if they would consider establishing an endowment with the funds they were raising to help support the museum in perpetuity. Well, they thought that was a great idea and eventually began saving that money, putting it aside. Well, they'd already done some of that. But at some point in the late 1990s, they decided it was appropriate to invest that money in the Wichita Community Foundation. And at that point, they invested a little under $300,000 with the foundation. To date, that foundation, through the foundation's efforts and the endowment funds that were created there, the estimated value of the endowment funds now is over $3.6 million. So we have had a significant impact, I think, on the museum and its support. It's specifically designated for acquisitions and exhibitions. And in 2000, we established the Howard Wooden Lecture Series. That was in honor of Howard Wooden, who was director and then director emeritus until his death in 1995. This series has gone on, and this will be the 20th year for the Howard Wooden Lecture Series. So we are very proud to be able to sponsor this and to thank the many people who have engaged with us to raise the funds necessary to make this possible. So I hope you will enjoy this evening's presentation, and I'm pleased to introduce Patricia McDonald, director of the museum.
Welcome, welcome, and thank you, Janet. We love the Friends. It is another snowy day in Kansas. Pleased to greet the number of people who are here at the Art Museum and everybody else on Zoom. I'm Patricia McDonald, director of the museum, and we say hi to Renée Ater, too, who's our speaker. Winter storm snarls kept her from getting on a magic carpet ride to come to Kansas, and so we've learned in this day and age of global pandemic to do Zoom. So we're not totally at a loss. We still have our speaker. It's just virtually. So Dr. Ater, I'll be introducing you in just a second. She is emeritus professor from University of Maryland, but she's currently in Providence, Rhode Island, where she is the provost visiting professor in Africana Studies. So I want to go back to Janet and acknowledge the Friends and this evening programs that is supported by and in important ways organized by the Friends organization here. We love them, we love them. They're in the trenches with us so often for so many different things. And I particularly appreciate that along their path of service to the community of Wichita through the Wichita Art Museum, they wanted to honor the museum director, someone who was a great leader over the time that he was here from 1975 to 1989. So it's just a great thing that his legacy lives on in this named lectureship. So before, though, I give official introduction, I want to encourage all of you in Zoom land, and as well folks in the room, to come back to the Art Museum for a handful of March programs. We've had some slides rotating. This lecture occurs in conjunction with our current major exhibition, which is American Art Deco. Aaron Douglas, the topic artist of this evening, has a number of just incredible masterpieces, paintings that are part of the exhibition. So I also want to note just another thing that is great about the Friends. They support this lecture series. They support all our exhibition programming across the year. So March 10th, we have a talk by Jonathan Hagel. He's a history professor at the University of Kansas. The American Art Deco show is about Deco with a different twist. The curator really wanted us to understand these wonderful works of largely decorative arts within a larger historical, cultural, and societal context. And so we have a history professor coming to give us that lens. And then on March 31st, someone who's really quite beloved here in Wichita, Jim Hellman, will speak. He's a retired art professor from Wichita State University. He was there, I think, for 40-some years. He's also a very, very talented graphic designer, and he's going to come for a presentation about lettering and fonts, and really a love and specialty of his within the Art Deco era. So, Renée Ater, we're warming up to you, a speaker who is connecting with us remotely from the East Coast. I mentioned that she was a professor at the University of Maryland in the Washington, D.C. area. That was for 22 years, and she's now an emeritus professor there. She's in New England, however, at the moment, in Providence, with a special position at Brown University, as I mentioned before. Really a gifted scholar who's focused on African American experience and then its expression through African American works of art. Interesting to me that she's not limited her inquiries to a specific time period. Her projects really reach from the 19th century into now the 21st century. She did, just as examples, she did a 2005 book on the contemporary artist Keith Morrison. He's a Jamaican who's been living in the United States for many decades in both teaching and in various university roles and as a practicing artist. Her most recent book, so it came out with the University of California Press just last year in 2021, is on the sculptor Meta Warwick Fuller. That is a woman and African-American sculptor from turn of the century period into the early decades of the 20th century. And she spent quite a bit of time with an intellectual inquiry and analysis on slavery, memory of slavery, and how public monuments express that, I would say, stain on American history. But we invited her because of her expertise on Aaron Douglas. She was involved in a retrospective on the artist that was presented at the Spencer Art Museum at the University of Kansas in 2007. Douglas is a person who grew up in Kansas. He grew up in Topeka, but he went off to the big city of New York and was a leader in the 1920s and the 1930s of the Harlem Renaissance. To quote from the exhibition catalog that Dr. Ater was a part of, one of the scholars said, and I quote, "His work stood at the center of cultural developments of his day, really ahead of its time and broadly influential." So Dr. Ater is going to help us to understand all of that. And I, through the magic of technology, turn this talk over to you, Renée Ater. So thanks.
I have to get used to the fact that there is an audience there. So let me pull up this first slide. So thank you for your comments. I appreciate the invitation to speak at the Wichita Museum of Art, and unfortunately I'm sitting in my apartment in Providence due to malfunctioning airplanes, ice, and a storm that's headed our way, as well as stormy weather in Dallas. I just couldn't make it out there yesterday. But I want to thank Tara Hendrick for the invitation to give the Howard E. Wooden Lecture this evening. And thanks to both Terry Pointer and Matt Buckingham as well for just helping me out and the big turnaround that they were able to do so quickly in setting up the Zoom presentation. So this evening, what I would like to do is to talk about Black modernist creative expression, and to look at Noah's Ark and then to move away from it and then come back to it. I'm interested in it as a painting that is obviously related to James Weldon Johnson's God's Trombones, and so I'll explore that a bit as well. But first, where I wanted to start actually was to, hold on one second, there we go, is to actually dedicate this lecture to Dr. Amy Helen Kirschke, who was both a colleague and a friend. She died in November of last year. And Amy had done the significant work, this book on Aaron Douglas called Art, Race, and the Harlem Renaissance. She wrote a book about W.B. Du Bois and the illustrations in the Crisis magazine. She was dedicated to kind of the archaeology and retrieval of African American artists. So this lecture is for her, someone who I have long admired. In fact, I had wanted to write my dissertation on Aaron Douglas, but Amy got to it first, and I ended up writing a dissertation on Meadowlark Wark Fuller. So what I like to start is this kind of structured in 5 parts. I've decided not to read a real formal lecture. I don't do that much anymore, but to kind of talk through the images and see what we can learn through the images and how we respond to them, but also to look closely at the relationship between Aaron Douglas and James Weldon Johnson, but also to think about Douglas more expansively. Obviously, he is in the show on Art Deco, but to think about him more expansively in relationship to modernism writ large. So I want to start actually by looking at the painting that's in the American Deco show, and to talk a little bit about it visually, and what is it that we're seeing here? What makes it stand out? What makes it, a really kind of unusual take of the Bible story of the biblical story of Noah's Ark, and to really situate it in this notion of a Black Christianity, and what does that look like when one shifts to figuring the Black body right into the Bible. So on the left is a photograph by Carl Van Vechten of Aaron Douglas. I've always liked this image. I've always noticed one of the most interesting things is Aaron Douglas is always quite serious in his photographs from this time period. I believe this photograph's from 1930. But he looks at us directly into the camera lens. And there is this beautiful flowered curtain that is on his right side. And then this void of what appears to be a doorway behind him. But we get the sense of this kind of illumination of his seriousness of his project. Now on the right is an image that I'm going to assume that many of you have seen in the show. And it is a painting from about 1935, and it is entitled Noah's Ark. It is a painting that is based on an illustration that Aaron Douglas created for the volume God's Trombones, and I'll talk about the illustration history. But I wanted us just to look and see what exactly are we looking at here? What makes this such a remarkable image? Why is the Black body figured here? So one of the things that I have always been really interested in Aaron Douglas, and I've written on his mural paintings a lot and worked on those, as well as writing my master's thesis on God's Trombones and Douglas's relationship as an illustrator to James Weldon Johnson, but to a whole group of other writers of the time period of the 1920s, what is now called the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro Renaissance. So we have this image, Noah's Ark, and we see Noah is up here, is up here on top. We see an ark, we see very industry, we see people, animals entering the ark. But what I like to talk about is a little bit is compositionally, the way in which Douglas often used kind of a tripartite composition to tell a narrative story. We see this over and over in his large-scale mural paintings. I was kind of fascinated in the last couple weeks to be looking at this painting again and to think about how he kind of segmented the composition and then brings it back together to tell the story of that moment where the lightning is coming, and there is the potential for the flood is coming, and there is the busyness of labor, and particularly of the laboring Black body. And one of the things that I'll propose, I'm not going to give a whole spin on this, but I do propose that what's so interesting about this volume, about this painting, as well as several of the other paintings, is the way in which it envisions this kind of future of Blackness in labor and building their own world, whether that be in a biblical world or it be in the modern period of the Harlem Renaissance. So let's look at this first top, what I consider the first band. And don't freak out that I've broken the painting apart a little bit through using Photoshop, but I wanted to really get at this. Because one of the things that is so interesting about Douglas is, first of all, is the way that he beautifully uses this idea of tint and shade, right? So he's mixing pure colors with white, and he's mixing pure colors with black to get shade, and he's playing with them to give us the scales of color within the painting. He's also has this, so here is Noah, and he's pointing off towards this zigzag, right? So the threat is imminent of the storm that is coming. And we see these bands of what seem like, sometimes when we can even see those bands of rain starting to fall. And over Noah is this concentric circles, and it moves outward, and it's a beam of light. If you kind of, so it's almost as if we're looking through this kind of kaleidoscope and moving it, and seeing the sky, the sun, and the rain, and the thunder, and the undulating lines that suggest water. In this image, we also, what's so fast, and I'll point this out when we get to the print, to the illustration for the book, is that we see in silhouette, and this is a very popular form that I'll talk a little bit about Douglas using that later on, but we'll notice that there's this interesting thing pointing upward, and it seems to be that the tip of the arc is connecting right up to this radiant light that is kind of enveloping the arc. We also see, and it's all men that we see laboring here alongside alongside Noah. I assume that we can, that these are his sons and sons-in-laws, but we see a man laboring with a hammer. In the middle zone, what I want to say is the bulk of the arc, this weightiness, the way in which it comes out at us in the image, so that this hard edge here and this modulation in tonal value, right, between the darker kind of purple color here moving into kind of a gray and then moving into lighter gray with the birds flying in. And then we see this wonderful moment. My husband and I were debating, are these bears or cats? But we see an animal with the tail, which I assume is maybe a lion, and then another animal with its very large paws walking up the ramp very peacefully into the belly of the ark. And we see another laboring man here climbing a ladder. So there's an urgency, right? With the zigzags coming here, the weight, this incredibly beautiful zigzag line. And then we have the man in front who's holding this enormous beam that's wedged. Perhaps he's removing it, but we have this stunning silhouette with the slit eye, the full nose, coming down to the full lips and the chin, and then we see Douglas's signature. So this real play between color, even though it's a rather monochromatic image, but between those blues and the purples and those purple grays, really activating the image. So why is this image so kind of astounding in 1927 when it is, or really this painting is from 35, the volume is from 27, the Gouache Drawings from 27 as well. So that this image is important enough to Aaron Douglas that he returns to it, right? Nearly 8 years post creating the illustrations. And what this does, this image, is really, as I've said before, is he's celebrating both this, or situating Blackness in Christianity, but also this sense of the labor of Black men in supporting this future Black world that will come out of this watery realm. His image is so fundamentally different that I just couldn't help myself but pull up some comparisons of Noah's Ark that might be registered in our minds. And I show here an Edward Hicks Noah's Ark from 1846, which is actually a fairly standard image that gets reproduced again and again in relationship to how we understand the 2x2 animals boarding the Noah's Ark with the big storm cloud really perched above the water as it rises and the animals enter. There's also the very popular Currier and Ives Noah's Ark that has been in wide circulation. We see various men here in turbans. We see Noah at the top here. The birds and the beast are entering the arc as well, so that we have this push against that traditional imagery. And here we see Douglas sometimes is described under this idea of geometric symbolism. He's looking to analytic cubism. He's looking to American precisionism. He's looking to African art. Like, he has sources are actually quite deep. But one of the things that he does over and over, and we'll see this in other images, but is this manipulation of what I call geometry. So if I call it geometric symbolism, what do I mean by that? This manipulation of circles, of triangles, of rectangles, and squares. So that he's using this really powerful geometry and then disrupts it a little bit with these undulating lines, right? So we have the massive force of the arc, and with these forms, geometric forms all around it. He also plays a lot, almost exclusively, with the black silhouette, turning to Egyptian art. I was rereading my master's thesis for this talk and had kind of forgotten the way he talked about Egyptian art very clearly in letters that are in the archive at the Schomburg. But he celebrated kind of Black Christianity as a Black celebrated Christianity as a Black experience. And he wrote of this, so I want to read this a little bit because I do think it tells us a little bit about her work, about his work. He wrote that I concentrated on the form of the body. I simplified the form so the lines were rigid and produced a primitive effect, and we'll talk about that. I made the figures flat without a three-dimensional representation. So he is really not after representation of the Black body, but a suggestion of Blackness is really key here. I did this by making the figures without any light and dark, giving them what is known as the Egyptian form. So this representation, and then he talks about using a slit as representative of the eyes and giving a face in what he calls a strong Black, quote, Negro appearance. So he's very clear in articulating in his own writings what he thinks he's doing with his work. So what are these inspirations for this Black modernist form that he's creating that doesn't look like any Noah's Ark that we know? What is his training? What is his background? What is he turning to? So I want to look at just a few things. There's a lot. What's amazing to me about Aaron Douglas is how he looks at a range of what we call art historical sources and adapts different elements that work for him in his painting to create to synthesize and create a new kind of syncretic art form. At the top, and I'll pull these up as full images, but just to show you, he trained with Reynold Rice in New York City, and that is a drawing here. He was deeply influenced by the African art collection that was at the Barnes Foundation, as well as the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And both of these collections had significant collections of Dan masks, and this is one that he would certainly have seen that was in the collection when he was at the Barnes in 1925 from the Dan peoples as well. But there's also the discovery of King Tut's tomb during this time period in 1922, and he's referencing Egyptian art. And I want to talk a little bit about the kind of the mania that happens around that as well. And as well as at the Barnes, I really want to tie Douglas more, consciously to the Barnes Foundation because he visits there and he says, I can't believe how much modern art I've seen at the Barnes, both European and American modernism, and I am completely jazzed by this. And he also talks about that he sees Negro sculpture, and what he means by that is African mask and three-dimensional objects that Barnes has collected from Paul Guillaume, actually in Paris, in his Paris gallery. So Reynold Rice was born in Germany. Douglas ended up training at the Reynold Rice School in New York City. Rice is really known for his interest in decorative arts, and particularly in Jugendstil and Art Deco. But he trained and pushed Douglas to really find a Black art, a Black artistic expression. And not to stick with, for a while Douglas was doing what looks pretty much like any post-impressionist landscape painting. And Reynold Rice, by training him to broaden out a little bit, influenced him tremendously. And part of that influence is we'll see how someone like Rice, it tells him to go to the Brooklyn Museum and look at African art, but someone Rice is also looking at oceanic examples. We'll see this ray of light that Douglas will really become interested in looking at. But we also notice something with Rice in this image called Harlem Nights from 1925, that there's kind of multiple stories going on in the image. There's this young child, there's a couple who are kind of woman with her coily with her fan, there is some kind of game going on, there is the vitality of Harlem at night. With the Dan mask, and I pull this out in particular, there's been much written about his engagement with African art, but just to show in silhouette, if I were to show this to the side, but he identifies this is a mask that was owned by the Barnes Foundation. But there were examples that were in the New York Public Library in the Schomburg division that was the Douglas frequented. There was the Blondeau collection there. Alain Locke was collecting art objects. So that Douglas had a real access, and he found particular, it seems to me, interest in this idea of this slit eye, this almost triangular treatment of the nose and the full lips. I can't stress enough, and this is something that I'm really interested in general, and thought I would actually write a book about Egyptomania at some point. But when Howard Carter, well, first of all, the MFA in Boston and Harvard University had been doing digs in Egypt and in Nubia, and the Crisis magazine, the arm of the publication arm of the NAACP, run by W.B. Du Bois, had been covering archaeological digs within its pages. And Douglas is working in the offices of the Crisis. So the fact that he's turning to Egyptian form is not surprising. It is also proliferating in American and European culture as advertisements, as dress, as jewelry. So that there's this kind of Egyptomania that happens in the 20s after Howard Carter opens the tomb of Tutankhamun, and we see these wall paintings, which for sure these were reproduced. This was on the pages of the New York Times. You would have had to have been in a cave to have missed this discovery. But what's so fascinating is even before the discovery of Howard Carter of King Tut's tomb, already there was this interest in Egypt because of all of this work that's happening. And I just show you this very odd ad called the Palm Olive advertisement, Reincarnation of Beauty, where a woman, if she uses this kind of secret formula, will be transformed from the goddess to the present goddess. I mean, it's very interesting the way in which her hand extends through her body. But this idea of advertising and of the presence of Egypt in the 20s it's prevalent in music and theater and dance, on the stage, in the newspaper. People were very aware of this. But what Douglas really borrows from the Egyptian form is the head and profile, the frontal chest, and then the hips and leg going sideways. This will become a form that for him connects Blackness to Egypt. And there's a reclaiming of Egypt at this time period as well by Black scholars, and particularly by someone such as W.B. Du Bois as well, arguing that this 18th Nubian dynasty should be celebrated as part of the larger Egyptian dynasties as well. I also just point out that one of the things that he saw at the Barnes Foundation was this remarkable collection of Picassos and Cézannes and George Braque, and actually the American Charles Demuth, who I see as having a very interesting relationship to Aaron Douglas. But we see with this early work by George Braque that kind of almost Cézannesque elements to it, the fracturing of form of that table, of the picture, the real short use of the brushstroke. But we're starting seeing the breaking apart of form here in that picture. I turn to Charles Demuth because I'm really interested in the way in which he uses that fracturing of line and form here, of the triangles, of the triangles and rectangular forms that repeat over and over in this image. And that seems to me certainly that Aaron Douglas is very aware of his American modernist compatriots and what they're doing. He is a man who's going to galleries, to museums, and really keeping his mind open to all sorts of ways of creating this new, what I call Black creative expressive form, or Black modernity during this time period. So one of the things that Aaron Douglas does that's really essential to me is not only is he he's looking at all of this art, and he's thinking about how he wants to create a very distinctive, what Alain Locke called a racial idiom in art, trying to actually to take the Black body out of the stereotype, out of that image of, let's say, the Aunt Jemima or the Zipcoon that's just proliferating during this time period, and to actually dignify, one could argue, Black men and Black women through his visual form. He is one of the things that I think is so thrilling about Aaron Douglas is that he is an illustrator to start with and then becomes a painter. But because of his work with Winald Rice and this emphasis on particularly interest in design, he does a lot of covers of magazines, and he does numerous dust jackets for some of the most famous writers of this time period: Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Wallace Thurman. It's astounding. The list goes. James Weldon Johnson. The list goes on and on. They all want Aaron Douglas's art on the cover of their books. And why is that? Because he is doing work for both Opportunity, which was the journal of the National Urban League, and although I don't have an illustration, he does a few covers for the Crisis magazine as well, as I mentioned, the official magazine of the National Association for Colored People, for the Advancement for Colored People. So this is really important that he is basically being disseminated through through magazines and through a public forum, through the press. On the left is an astonishing image on the cover of the February 1926 issue, in which she is celebrating here Black industry and Black male labor. We see, and he's using this incredible shattering of form. We see this almost prismatic handling of the gray tones of value here and shattering, so that he's looking to analytical cubism. He's looking actually to Picasso and Braque, but he's doing something else. He wants to maintain, and at the same time he's kind of combining these interests. I mean, they're so varied, but combining an interest in what is cubism, but also in Art Deco design, but also in making prevalent and visible this Black laboring body. So we see two men who are hammering and working at a very hot flame. In the background, we see two cabins where smoke is coming out of it. We see this kind of sunburst pattern in between their legs, but it's an image that is filled with action, with reverberation. Every strike seems to reverberate into a prismatic gray scale here. If it was in color, it would just be vibrating for sure. On the right, we see more emphatically that use of that Egyptian silhouette and the Dan mask with that slit eye, full nose, and the protruding lips. Some criticize this as verging almost on stereotype of that kind of Sambo image. Douglas argued for this image as being tied, actually, that he wasn't going to use African masks to fracture form, but to actually use the physical features here. But we see the face in profile, the body head on, and technically if this man was standing up, his body would also be in profile and the feet going straight. But behind him, he does something so interesting. Not only do we see this man sitting here on this, but behind him is something important. That out of the pyramids of Giza that we see here, 1, 2, 3 along the back, is the new urban city along a river. And so we see the rise of a church, some buildings here, and that there is this kind of direct connection between, let's say, the Mississippi River to the Nile. And that's, of course, happens through Langston Hughes's very famous poem. But Douglas is making a connection of Black life here to that long tradition of cultural production out of Egypt as well. But we'll notice here that we see these kind of organic forms as well that are also, to me, reminiscent of the way in which other artists who are working kind of an Art Deco mode are visualizing the natural world. He also, so he is editing he is working as a cover illustrator, and then he begins this kind of what I think is a phenomenal collaboration with Langston Hughes. And he and Langston Hughes are friends. They're going out together. There's these great letters where Douglas talks about going, to hear jazz with Langston Hughes, to go to rent parties, to socialize and talk about, what is this thing that they're trying to do during the Harlem Renaissance? What does it mean to embrace Blackness? What does it mean to really center Black life, Black culture, Black identity in one's artistic production? And so here, this will be repeated, and I show it to you just as an early kind of Christian imagery. In silhouette is at the feet of Jesus. We see with these outspread arms in praise and looking up to the sky towards the heavens. But that there's this real intimate relationship. And one of the things that I've argued both in my master's thesis 30 years ago and what I would argue today is that Aaron Douglas really understood the literary output of this time period. He understood kind of his job as illustrator was not to just illustrate a line, but really to evoke, right? The poem, the free verse, the short story. He was able to encapsulate some of this through imagery. So here in Down and Out with the Langston Hughes poem, you see a woman who has a cup out saying, "I needs a dime for beer." But this use of lino cut at this point for that stark contrast between black and white. And so then we'll see that he will start to move to using the collotype, a gelatin printing process. And out of that I think it's October of 26 issue for Opportunity Magazine, he's invited with Langston Hughes to create an art portfolio of the 8 of I think 6 or 7 of these prints, along with the cover and with Langston Hughes poetry. So this sets him up basically that to continue to be the artist working with literary men and women. And lastly, I just show you before I go to really looking at the relationship to God's Trombones, that he's also very much part of an avant-garde group of young men and women who are trying to break away from more traditional ways of thinking about what they should be producing, whether it's a poem, whether it's line drawing, whether it's illustration. Here we see in Fire, devoted to younger Negro artist, a more exaggerated form of that silhouetted black face, and then he ties that black face again to the Sphinx of Egypt sitting here. So this really intense contrast and play between the black and white. So what is this God's Trombones? It's a really important text. It was called God's Trombones, 7 Negro Sermons in Verse from 1927. And it was an intense collaboration between Aaron Douglas and James Weldon Johnson, who was an astonishing man. He had a law degree. He worked at the NAACP, was its leader for a while. He was a musical composer. He wrote free poetry. I mean, he just really, in many ways, was a Renaissance man. And you're looking at a Winald Rice portrait here on the right of James Weldon Johnson, and on the left is a self-portrait that Aaron Douglas did in 1954. Again, that kind of seriousness of expression of both men was really conveyed in this both self-portrait and then the portrait by Rice. So God's Trombones, 7 Negro Sermons in Verse. And it's interesting, Douglas says, well, he ran into James Weldon Johnson in the hallway of the Crisis magazine, and James Weldon Johnson asked him, would you illustrate this series of sermons or poetry in verse that I have created? And they formed a relationship there. Now, there's not much that tells us how exactly this worked out, but there is a way, and they're in free verse. And what James Weldon Johnson decided to use was a poetry form that was not rooted in dialect. He was very worried about the way in which Black dialect was used as almost a stereotype Black language, but he wanted very much to get at this cadence of the Black preacher's voice within this volume. to get at the cadence, to get at the way in which he used language, the way in which there's certain kind of repetitions of certain kinds of sermons that are spoken in the Black church, all of this. So there's this very intimate relationship between image, text, and sound throughout the volume. So Douglas, to go through these, there were 7 of these illustrations. And the first was Listen, Lord, a Prayer. And in the image, it says basically there's this direct correlation between the image and the text that reads, O Lord, we come this morning, knee bowed and body bent before thy throne of grace. So what Douglas has shown is a Black body, knees bent. We see these kind of jagged lines, but most importantly, we see these bands of rays of light coming from the heavens, right? So that God is listening. And this is one of the most astounding things about this sermons in free verse that James Weldon Johnson attempted to capture of the Black preacher, is this way in which the humanness of God and his relationship with the Black subject in the text is really profound. The next is called The Creation. And again, I want to pull up that he actually originally did, what's so fascinating is that there's 3 iterations of these images. The first are the gouache drawings, which I show you here. Then are the colotypes in the book, or the gelatin prints that are in the book. And then he did the paintings about 8 years later. So there's a way in which he returns to this imagery in really interesting ways. The gouache drawings are astounding in their use of value as a tool, these kind of blue grays. But here we know that God creates Adam, a Black man, because he is lonely. He says, in fact, as this hand, we see the hand of God reaching through the firmaments to say, and to create, because he's a lonely. He creates, there's a merging of Greek kind of mythology here. He creates Adam from the soil. He scoops up the clay, he kneels down, and then the sky lights up. There are rainbows and there are stars that appear in the sky. And out of this dust comes the living soul of Adam, this Black man who is the first man. And so we see this moment with undulating lines, with the rainbows, and with these concentric circles that move through the image as well. So we see this idea of God smiles, actually. The light breaks as the poetry, and that this hand reaching down, this Black figure is not afraid. He stands there erect and tall, engaging with the presence of a higher being here. Then the prodigal son is the one that is a little outside the real depths of this particular, well, it's outside of the visual iconography of the rest of this volume, but it ties back to that image I showed you of Harlem Nights by Ronald Rice. Here we see that is in fact the prodigal son. And it differs dramatically in the sense that it is the corruptible big city. It is Harlem, the nightclub. It is the jazz from Trombones. It is gin. It is dancing. It is seduction. It is cards and money exchange and dice and liquor that are happening. And so this idea of both evoking the Harlem nightclub and the sound of jazz. Here's God's trombones, or the sound, right, of God's voice here, but it is also sound of this new sounds of jazz, the music that was playing before I began my talk today. And here it is in the gouache drawing, the original gouache drawing as well. And this real, what here we see a much more intense articulation through that kind of blue-gray, emanating out of the light fixture onto the central figure of the prodigal son, as with their slit eyes, full lips, as they are kind of engaging each other and having a good party. In the middle of this text, there's kind of an interlude, and it is a funeral sermon, Go Down Death. It is a kind of a moment of pause in the text of the free verse. It's quieter, it's more somber, and it's the announcement that Sister Caroline has met death. And it says, weep not, she is not dead. She is resting in the bosom of Jesus. Heartbroken husband, weep no more. Grief-stricken son, weep no more. Left loathsome daughter, weep no more. She's only just gone home. So in this instance, instead of there being this kind of looking up to God, as we saw in some of these pretty previous images, and here's the astonishingly beautiful gouache drawing, we see the figure of death is on a horse and streaming down from the heavens, coming to this pinpoint where she has died. So we see this movement across, right, the heavens to earth. He gallops through the golden streets without a sound. And in this instance, what's so powerful about this poem is that death is depicted as this transition from the mundane earthly existence throughout the poem, through the language of the poem, to this higher heavenly state. So that there is this idea that God's big heart was touched with pity and he reached down to Sister Caroline, who was lying in pain, and death came to her. And then there was something else on the other side of that. That there is throughout, and here is Noah's Ark, right? The original drawing, the gouache drawing doesn't exist, but we have the collotype print. And we see that there's something slightly different in the way that he's handling. The ark still is heavy, but we have two men here who are holding the ark in place. We see less of its superstructure. In the painting, we have more of the ark shown. He changed both animals to cats, walking up more distinctively, and we have more laboring men. But we get that sense of the radiant light from the celestial radiant light through this triangular form suffuses this image. What is really powerful about Noah built the ark is that there is this conversation between Noah and God, that they walked and talked together. And that this is a story, it's really interesting, that begins actually with the story that the reason that that this all happens is the Garden of Eden, that we must have, that is the sin of mankind, right? And that God's destruction of earth by flood, sparing Noah and his family. And he's done this because as the preacher preaches in this poem, Noah was a just and righteous man. But again, there is this situating, if Adam is the original black man, here Noah is going out under the covenant of God to be protected, to transform and go to a new place, to a new world that is black created in this instance within the poem. And that this ray of light is meant to suggest this dialogue that is constantly going on between God in the beginning of the poem and Adam, but later this conversation constantly where God says to Noah, go build an ark, and he says, Noah, build thee an ark. And so he does. It is not a quiet scene. And this is something that I explore very in depth in my master's thesis. But the notion that there is this sound that suffuses all of these. There's sounds that are reiterated over and over again in the poem, but also the way in which Douglas uses these concentric circles moving outward. Douglas was, in fact, fascinated by the radio, which had come into being kind of in the early 20s as the first, I think, radio broadcast was of music was the Metropolitan Opera. I want to say in 1921, but the radio is becoming this space of black voices through blues music. So Douglas is in this poem. There's an interesting overlay. We've got jazz, we've got the blues, we have spirituals that are also very much embedded in these as well. But this activity is activity of men, and I want to point that out. Douglas does do a lot of images of women, but in this particular volume in general, it is the story of men in particular that come to the front. The crucifixion is not Christ here, but an image of Simon the Syrian who carried the cross to Golgotha. And it was Simon the Syrian because he was called Black Simon in the Bible. So again, resituating this story of the crucifixion to include a black man, and then we see the Romans with their spears tormenting, and at the center is Christ. We know this because we can see a little halo, and there it is, Jesus, my gentle Jesus, walking in the dark of the Garden of Gethsemane, saying to the three disciples, sorrow is in my soul, even unto death. Tarry you here a little while and watch with me. So this multi-layered story of, first we have the image of Christ, then we have this image of of Simon carrying the cross, and then in the foreground the Romans, who looked very different. They don't have those full lips. They have these elongated chins, narrow noses, and thin mouths that make them quite different from Simon here as well. And lastly, we come to, I think, oh, I missed one page, but we come to the Judgment Day. And we have the angel Gabriel with 1 foot on land and 1 foot in the sea. And he's blowing the trumpet, right? The sounds are there. And we see one person who is definitely going above. And it's hard to tell what will happen to these 3 men here. One is kneeling, kind of cowering as if something's happening. One's holding a bowl where there's a lightning bolt coming down. But we have this sound coming forth very strongly in this image. And it's all, and I skipped one image by accident because there was another one called Let My People Go. So the crucifixion, Let My People Go, Judgment Day are all tied to Black spirituals as well as to the sound of the Black preacher's voice. And there's the really stark gouache. Again, those tonal values are really astonishing, and the way and control with the concentric circle, with the zigzags, with the bands and rays of light that he's able to evoke this presence of a divine above in relationship to the very humanness of this experience of the Judgment Day. So why turn back to these paintings? Because I have always found this really interesting. Not only is God Trombone hailed as a really, the press on this during the 1927-28 was astounding. It was favorably received by both white and Black critics who talked about it as this powerful aphoconium of poetry, and Douglas's ability to capture the tone through his drawings that rely on value, the way in which there is this celebration by critics of the Black voice being heard throughout, but the Black voice also being kind of resonant in Aaron Douglas's images as well. So between 1935 and 39, he returns to these images, and I think partly because they work so beautifully in color, and I think he's done in 1934. He does a series of 4 murals that are quite famous in the Schomburg division of the New York Public Library, which was segregated at that point. But he does these 4 murals, and after that, he returns to the theme of Gaunt's trombones that he started with gouache and then these types, and then he does these really beautiful color studies, is how I would like to read them, in which he does this. They're very muted, so he's really using tint and shade here in really beautiful ways, but using colors that are very close in proximity, using these kind of yellow and greens, hues of yellow green with a slight ochre kind of side by side, using here oranges and slight purples. Again, the creation and go down depth. They're really powerful with color, the fluid handling of color and kind of color relationships that he sets up. And then these astonishing ones that are green and purple that are really, that are both secondary colors. But we have the supersonic yellow light, that divine yellow light that we see here and here, and the rush of here. And this is what I forgot to show you earlier, Let My People Go, is Moses in Egypt. We see the pyramids, we see Moses, and it is again a Black Moses. And we know the threat of thunder. The God is light has enveloped, and here the Egyptians are in trouble because the seas are about to part and the waves are about to completely overwhelm them, right, as Moses parts the Red Sea. And here again, the Judgment Day with sound. There's kind of a cacophony that we feel, that I see. It's this kind of projection of sound. Gabriel has the trumpet, and he holds the keys to the gates of heaven. And I end here with on Noah's Ark. partly because I want to actually place it a little bit more within a context of the the early 1900s and within modernism. Douglas was also, he was interested in Gurdjieffism, but I also think that there are these other movements that are happening that he is certainly aware of because of the way in which he's working with Ronald Rice, this German artist. And that is of the Frenchman Robert Delaunay. And here we have simultaneous contrast, sun and moon. You might think, what is the relationship that she's making here? But for me, it's something really powerful about the interaction of color. And how the interaction of colors can produce depth and sensation. That this is really important. And here, obviously, it's more pronounced. We have someone like Douglas chooses often to use monochromatic or colors that are very next to each other, adjacent colors. And often in this case, we have the blues and the purples and a little pink that he's playing with in Noah's Ark. But there is this with Orphism, this idea that there are simultaneous contrasts, that they create a rhythm of the cosmos. And I think that too is something that Douglas is suggesting, that there is this environment out there, this world, and that there's a pulsation to it. That if this is the universe, this is the universe as well. So I see a really intense relationship between that's sometimes called Orphism, but with this interest in breaking up light, that light creates colored planes, and we see that here and here, and we see it in the really beautiful way in which he's fractured the concentric circles, so that this of colored plane structure, this for Delaunay it becomes abstraction. For Douglas, the color, this kind of refraction of light, these color planes actually help tell the narrative, and that's a really important difference. But there's some kind of play here with an understanding actually of color that's really deep. I also think that synchromism is something that I think also is very important. Stanton McDonald Wright and Morgan Russell had major exhibitions in New York before Douglas was there, but synchromism again was very much interested in both in pure abstraction, but using color and connecting color to sound. This idea of tonal harmonies constructed with color chords. They were very interested in, for example, in synesthesia as well. But this kind of idea that light and color and the fracturing of light creates rhythm, creates pulsation and sound on the surface. So there's both this kind of incredibly pulsation related to this, I think, in the way in which Douglas also approaches color. And lastly, because I think I need to leave a little time for questions, no, there's two more images and I'll be done. I want to actually tie this a little bit back to Ronald Rice, and then I have one last big painting to look at. Douglas's relationship with Rice was very intimate, and we know this from the letters that he wrote to his future wife, Alta. But we know if we look here in this beautiful, this is Langston Hughes, and this was done for the New Negro anthology edited by Alain Locke in 1925. So before Douglas has come to this signature style, even before he's done his illustrations. But we see even there that someone like with Conti crayon is using that prismatic light, is showing various kind of narrative scenes where someone's literally that being inspired by the music is coming off the page, and then all of this in the context of Harlem. And that kind of relationship to Rice is very deep. And I always make this connection, and I want to end the talk here with a comparison to Charles Dimas' My Egypt, and to really argue that their engagement with modernism does two very different things. Aaron Douglas is situating Black life at the heart of the modern endeavor. And Charles Dimas is really looking to this, and they're both looking to Egypt, which I find fascinating here. But here, what is the equivalent, or if there's some have read this as being a critique, but let's say this Egypt here is the grain elevator that we see here, that it becomes in some ways a modern day equivalent to the monuments of ancient Egypt, whereas Douglas celebrates the pyramid as being created by Black bodies. This wants to draw, the DMIF does this really, it's one of my favorite paintings along with Aaron Douglas. I have a thing for this. I think precisionism, it's geometric dynamism on the canvas. We see this fracturing of light here. There's a celestial form coming. It's just this cross relationship between the two of them working in America, trying to come to sorts about what is American art actually. What does it mean to look to Egypt and who gets to claim those spaces? But in the end, it is Aaron Douglas's power to visualize through color, through line, through geometry, through silhouette, this new vision of Black modern life, even through this religious subject matter. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Oh, and this is simply a sources list, which I can give to someone later on.
Wonderful. I'm not sure that you were able to hear the applause that was resonating here at the Wichita Art Museum. Listening to your talk, I'm even more heartbroken that the travel gods weren't able to bring you to us. We have a very plush red carpet here in Wichita that we were all ready to roll out for you. There is a question in the chat. D. Starkey was asking, there's gold lettering that is over the poems in God's Trombone. He loves it. Is that lettering also by Douglas? And thanks for including the wonderful Schomburg murals, at any rate. So that's
Oh, that is a super important question. Actually, hold on one second if I can get out of my PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
They are not done by Aaron Douglas. It is by another artist who does the lettering. And the lettering is super important. This kind of, thanks for actually asking that question. I'm blanking on the artist. His last name was Hill, but it is very much part of the design. So I would not want to actually separate the text, this kind of design text that we see here. That's kind of a Gothic / modern take on what the Gothic is how it's often described, but that idea of even the vibration of the text, I would argue, the way in which the lettering works, that if it's almost kind of breaking apart at the edges or splaying out in this sound, is very important. But Douglas did not create that. That was an artist who was hired to do the type of the headings for each of the free verse chapters, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. I really loved and appreciated your pulling in Robert Delaunay. I would have never, ever thought of making that linking connection, and particularly it seems to me to the geometric work that he included in the celebrations of modernity and urbanism in the series that he did on the Eiffel Tower. But the question I have for you, help our audience to understand better perhaps, what was the reception for Aaron Douglas in his time in the 20s and then into the 30s? And I would say certainly first in his circles within Harlem, but more broadly, either across Manhattan or across the country. I think he had a very positive response and was welcome, but would you agree? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question about the reception. So Aaron Douglas really is in many ways, he's brought to New York actually by Charles Spurgeon Johnson of Opportunity Magazine, who is, they're in the processes of building a Renaissance. It's the best way, it's how I describe it to my students. Basically, they're kind of sending out invitations to people of interest. And Aaron Douglas, while he's at the University of Kansas, and he's teaching then in Topeka, I think, afterwards, they're interested in his artwork. He's getting written up in the local newspaper, so he's invited to New York. And I love Douglas. He's saying, well, I'll come to New York, but really, I want to go to Paris. I will stop in New York to visit you, and then I want to keep moving on, because Paris is really where artists go to be trained. He lands in New York, and it's a really productive experience. They set him up. He gets a job. He gets, this 2 years fellowship or scholarship at the Rice School of Art. he gets a job at the Crisis magazine, and he's in the mix of it, right? And he really is anointed by Alain Locke, who is one of the principal architects of the Harlem Renaissance, as the Black artist of the Harlem Renaissance. So he is well received by his peers. It is why Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Wallace Sturman are asking him to create these imagery. He is really celebrated in the 20s for his artwork across the board. He is taken up by the Harmon Foundation in the late 20s, early 30s as well, which is a really important institution that enabled Black artists to show their work and gave out fellowships. He ends up going to Tuskegee excuse me, not Tuskegee. That's so funny. I have Tuskegee on the brain right now for a different project. He ends up going to Fisk. What a big no on my part. He ends up going to Fisk and really starting the art department. And that, he goes to Fisk right at the moment. I mean, the Depression's happening. James Weldon Johnson dies, I think, in 32. So people are starting to leave New York or seek different kinds of avenues. But he gets this teaching job and very rightfully goes to Fisk and has a very long and rich career there where he is well received. But in the 30s, what is so important about Aaron Douglas is that he becomes a mural painter, and he's hired by the U.S. government under the Rooseveltian Works Progress Administration. I believe the first mural project he does is a Treasury mural project, but then those library murals are really important. But he's doing things like design. We've lost a lot of these. He did murals in clubs in Harlem. There's a photograph of Van Vechten of where he's standing in a bathroom, and Van Vechten's trying to take his portrait against the painting that he's done in this club bathroom. So he's doing interiors. He's doing WPA style murals that are very political in nature. Actually, the murals in New York are very strongly political, and I would say in general his art is. And so that reception, he is in many ways becomes in some ways the artist of the Harlem Renaissance. That's kind of the repetitive story we hear. I think that's getting broken apart a little bit, but he still is so important as an illustrator to conveying this new image of Black modern life.
Knowing him as you do, and I know you've written about some of his mural and mural cycle projects, is that a natural leap for him, or is that really, so to speak, an employment opportunity because of the WPA funding that happens at that time? What's your sense of that?
I missed the very first part of the question.
Knowing your work on his multiple mural projects, do you think that's a natural leap for him, or is he really motivated by the opportunity for employment in the heart or the depth of the Depression, at any rate, with the kind of funding that became available for mural projects?
I think it's both. So he's already starting to do wall painting for clubs, and this graphic design that he does, his form, if you look on the left, really translates so beautifully to painting, right? To take that, basically what we would call grayscale, and to move it into color. In this flattened forms that he does in general, it works. His style works very well as illustration and painting, I would argue. But I also think the Depression hits and people are looking for employment and they're looking for ways to earn money. And so Douglas, receives these commissions, and they're really important because Black artists find it very difficult to crack into the WPA system as artists. There's a whole series of artists who work in Harlem on the Harlem Hospital, a series of murals, but they actually get accused of racism during the time period and are not encouraging Black artists to apply. And so the fact that Aaron Douglas finds work and produces the kind of murals that he wants without censorship of content is pretty amazing during this time period as well. So I think it's both the style that translates to painting fairly well, and then I need to earn a living, and mural painting allows, the WPA helped a lot of artists,
right,
survive, right, in the 30s.
Yeah. We have one last question in the chat, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it. You mentioned gel plate at one point, and then mentioned the book illustrations were done in calligraphy. Do you have more information about?
Yeah, so good question. I can see it up here on the chat. Yeah, so sorry about that.
Okay, go right ahead. Yeah,
So
jump in.
I kind of conflate those. I have always, so there are first gouache drawings, which are, gouaches. Sorry if I can get out of my presentation or
It's like
not.
a watercolor. It's a
It's like
heavier
a
medium.
water, but it's a heavier watercolor. So here you can see it's a heavier watercolor. Right, and it has this density, I think, gouache that I always love. So he does the gouache drawings, but these actually, I always knew them as gelatin, as a gelatin print process, which is a collotype, is also collotype, not calligraphy. Collotype is also a form of a more specific form of gelatin printing process. And so I used, when I talked about these as gelatin prints, but I think collotype is probably the more technical term that I saw more recently that a scholar has identified these as being of that kind of work.
Well, I happen to know that I could have question after question after question for you, Renee, but we should release you into the evening. We're thrilled that you came and give us such a good overview of this artist and his connection to this particular book project, the results of which we have as paintings in our Art Deco exhibition at the moment. So sorry that we didn't get to meet you, but surely now that we've discovered how amazing you are, there'll be another opportunity in the future. And all good luck to you. Best wishes at Brown University in your project there.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate everyone being able to pull this together this evening. And I do nothing I can do about the mechanical failure was just the beginning of the airplane of the travel disaster. So I do apologize I could not be there in person, but dear Aaron Douglas, even though I work on sculpture, has always been an artist that I have been just fascinated by since I was an undergraduate, actually, and felt privileged to write an MA thesis. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this painting and about his, work writ large.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, you all have a good evening.